At Glastonbury in 2025, four old road warriors walked onto a festival stage for a goodbye that had taken more than 60 years to arrive. The first single went to #1. The next wave put them beside the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Jerry and the Pacemakers. They had 3 British #1 records before most bands even learned how to survive a bad contract. Then the voice that helped define them was gone. Then the drummer who helped drive them was gone. Then the money, the kind that should have changed their lives forever, came back looking almost insulting. The chart positions are real, the Ed Sullivan appearance is real, the ripped-off money stories came from the men who lived through them. And the strangest part is this: their songs sounded bright, clean, and almost innocent, but behind that Merseybeat sparkle was a band learning how quickly success could turn into loss. They were not the loudest Liverpool band. They were not the most mythologized. They were the one that kept going long after the spotlight moved on, carrying the sound of needles and pins, Sweets for My Sweet, and When You Walk in the Room, into rooms that kept getting smaller, then somehow larger again. This is the Searchers' real story, and it ends with the farewell they almost never got. Before the screams, before the television cameras, before that clean guitar sound crossed the Atlantic, there was Liverpool. Not the polished Liverpool people later turned into a tourist myth, but the working city where young bands fought for club space and tried to sound sharper than the group waiting behind them. That was where John McNally, Mike Pender, Tony Jackson, and Chris Curtis started finding their shape. Even the starting date is messy. Some sources point to 1957, others to 1959, and others to 1960, when the group officially worked as Johnny Sandon and the Searchers. In a strange way, that confusion suits them. They did not arrive fully formed. They were built through name changes, club nights, and young men learning who belonged at the microphone. The name came from The Searchers, the John Ford Western starring John Wayne. It sounded dramatic, lonely, and bigger than 4 Liverpool boys playing for dancers. For a band still trying to escape the local pack, that kind of name mattered. At first, Johnny Sandon stood out front as the lead singer. Then he left for the Remo 4, and the group kept going without him. That became one of the earliest patterns in the band's life. Someone could leave, and the machine would still move. The lineup settled with McNally on guitar, Pender on guitar and vocals, Jackson on bass and vocals, and Curtis on drums and vocals. Tony Jackson even played a bass he had designed and built himself, which tells you something about the hunger in that scene. If the right instrument was not waiting for you, you made one. Their real school was not a classroom, it was the Iron Door, the Cavern, and then Hamburg, where Liverpool bands learned stamina the hard way. Long nights forced them to tighten harmonies, sharpen arrangements, and read a room fast. Nobody survived that circuit by sounding half awake. That grind separated dreamers from workers. Plenty of young bands wanted the glamour. The Searchers learned the hours. They learned how to repeat a song until it stopped feeling borrowed and started sounding like theirs. That skill became their weapon. By late 1962, they returned from Hamburg sharper than when they left. Soon, they were connected to producer Tony Hatch and Pi Records. The door was opening, and once it opened too fast. The Searchers did not ease into fame. They crashed straight into it. Their first major British single, Sweets for My Sweet, reached #1 in 1963. It stayed on the UK chart for 16 weeks, and for 2 of those weeks, it sat at the top. Think about that for a second. One moment, they were another Liverpool group trying to climb out of the club circuit. The next, they had a national hit strong enough to put them beside the biggest Merseybeat names of the day. The song was not written by them. Sweets for My Sweet came from Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, and that matters because the Searchers' gift was often interpretation. They could take the right song, strip it clean, brighten the harmonies, sharpen the guitars, and make it feel as if it had been waiting for them all along. That first hit also did something dangerous. It made everything look easy. Then came Sugar and Spice, another Tony Hatch production.
Sugar and spice and all things nice. You know that little girl.
Which climbed to #2 in Britain and reached #44 in America. It kept the momentum alive, But the bigger blow arrived in 1964 with Needles and Pins. That record changed the room. Needles and Pins hit #1 in Britain. Stayed on the UK chart for 15 weeks and held the top spot for 3 weeks. In America, it reached #13, giving the Searchers a real foothold in the British invasion. Suddenly, they were no longer just a Liverpool success story. They were part of a wave crossing the ocean. The timing could not have been better. American audiences were hungry for British groups, and Liverpool had become a magic word. The Searchers were not as wild as some of their rivals, and they were not as mythic as the Beatles, but they had something radio loved. Their records were bright, quick, and instantly clear. The sound was the key. Those crisp guitars and high harmonies did not punch like the rougher rock bands. They shimmered. They made heartbreak sound bright. That was the strange trick of the Searchers. A song could be wounded, but the record still glowed. Then came Don't Throw Your Love Away. Another British #1 in 1964. 3 UK chart toppers in one short burst. That was not luck. That was a band catching the exact speed of its moment. But speed can fool people. From the outside, the Searchers looked like a clean, unstoppable hit machine. Inside, the first serious crack was already waiting. Fame had arrived before the band had learned how to survive it. At their peak, the Searchers had a sound so polished it could hide almost anything. The guitars rang clean. The harmonies rose neatly. Needles and Pins, Don't Throw Your Love Away, and When You Walk in the Room carried the kind of brightness that made pain feel radio-friendly. They were not selling chaos, they were selling control. That is why the first major fracture feels so sharp. Tony Jackson, the bassist and one of the early defining voices, left in 1964. The exact reason has never been clear enough to treat as a settled fact. Some accounts leave the cause cloudy, and decades later the question of whether he quit or was pushed out still hung over the story. That uncertainty is part of the wound. Whatever happened behind the scenes, the timing was brutal. The band had already hit #1 with Sweets for My Sweet. They had reached #1 again with Needles and Pins. They were moving into America, where British groups were suddenly treated like visiting royalty. This should have been the moment when everyone held tight. Instead, one of the voices people knew was gone. Frank Allen came in during 1964, after playing with Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers, and helped keep the band alive at a level most groups would envy. That part matters. The Searchers did not collapse when Jackson left. They kept scoring, they kept working, they kept the name moving forward. Almost immediately, When You Walk in the Room proved the point. Written by Jackie DeShannon, the record reached #3 in Britain and #35 in America. It had that same Searchers shine, a romantic ache wrapped in a bright guitar line. Then Love Potion #9, written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, became their biggest American hit, climbing to #3 in the United States. For a band that had just lost a key original member, that was no small thing. But success can cover a wound without healing it. The public heard the records and saw the smiles. Fans saw a band still moving, still polished, still close enough to perfect. Behind that image was a harder truth. The Searchers had learned that a lineup could change even during the gold rush, and once that lesson enters a band, innocence does not come back. For Tony Jackson, life after the Searchers did not become another clean triumph. He formed Tony Jackson and the Vibrations, but the old momentum did not follow him in the same way. That makes his exit feel even heavier. A voice leaves a hit band, the band keeps climbing, and the man outside the circle has to watch the name continue without him. That is the part fans rarely hear inside the Bright records. They sounded untouched. They were not. By 1964, the Searchers were no longer just a British success. They were part of the invasion. America had opened its doors to Liverpool, and groups who had been sweating through clubs only a few years earlier were suddenly treated like visiting royalty. The Beatles led the charge, but they were not alone. The Searchers crossed that same ocean with records strong enough to make American radio listen. On April 5, 1964, they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, performing Needles and Pins and Ain't That Just Like Me. That show mattered. For British groups, Ed Sullivan was not just television, it was proof that America had noticed. Imagine the jump. A few years earlier, the band had been grinding through Liverpool and Hamburg. Now they were standing under American studio lights while millions could watch from home. For a Merseybeat band, that was the dream made visible. The bills around them were just as dizzying. Frank Allen later said the group shared stages with the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Cliff Richard, and Motown artists during those years. That was the world they had entered. Not the small club world anymore. The big machine. But the machine had teeth. Years later, John McNally spoke about the ugly side of that first American tour. He said musicians like the Searchers were ripped off in the 1960s, and when the money came back after that first American trip, it felt almost insulting. The fame was huge. The reward was not. That is the part that cuts through the nostalgia. The screaming fans were real. The chart numbers were real. The television appearance was real. But behind the bright suits and ringing guitars, the business side was already taking its share before the musicians understood what had happened. For fans, the Searchers represented a clean sound from a thrilling new Britain. For the men inside the band, success came with bills, deductions, managers, travel costs, and contracts they did not fully control. They had reached America, but America did not automatically make them rich. That wound changes the way the story feels. Because when you hear Needles and Pins now, it is easy to imagine nothing but young fame. The guitars shine, the harmonies rise, the record still sounds alive. Under that shine was a brutal lesson. A hit record could belong to the world, while the men who made it watched the money slip through someone else's hands. By the time they understood the game was already changing. The first great fracture had been Tony Jackson. The next one was Chris Curtis. In 1966, after an Australian tour with the Rolling Stones, Curtis, the drummer, and one of the band's key voices, left the Searchers. For listeners, the lineup change might have looked like another personnel note. For a band built on blend, it was bigger than that. A drummer is not just the man keeping time. In the Searchers, Chris Curtis also sang, shaped the group's energy, and helped give the records their snap. Losing him meant losing another piece of the original chemistry. John Blunt replaced him, and the group carried on. That phrase keeps returning in their story because it is almost the whole point. They carried on. They released Take It or Leave It. They released Have You Ever Loved Somebody? Which reached number 48 in Britain in 1966. But the old rush was fading. The chart positions were lower. The moment was moving. Music changed fast in the late 1960s. The bright Merseybeat sound that had once felt fresh began to seem tied to an earlier wave. Rock grew heavier, albums became statements. Psychedelia stretched pop into stranger shapes. Newer bands arrived with longer hair, louder amps, and bigger ideas about what rock could be. That did not make the Searchers worthless. It made them unfashionable. There is a difference. Their records still had craft. Their harmonies still had charm. Their guitar sound would echo later in folk rock, power pop, and bands that cared about clean melody. The industry, though, is rarely kind to groups whose moment has passed. One year, you are the future. A few years later, people treat you like yesterday's photograph. By the 1970s, they moved into the club circuit. That could sound like defeat, but it also shows a kind of stubborn dignity. The screams were smaller. The rooms were smaller. The cultural spotlight had gone somewhere else. Still, they played. Then, near the end of that decade, something unexpected happened. Respect began to return. Frank Allen later said that by the end of the 1970s, everything took off again, and there was a new respect for their past work. The old sound had survived long enough to be heard differently. Their late Sire Records period with albums like Searchers and Play for Today did not turn them back into the chart kings of 1964. But it gave them another chapter that matters. It proved the Searchers were not just a museum piece from Merseybeat's first explosion. They were a band with a sound people kept rediscovering. By the time Mike Pender left in December 1985, the Searchers had already lived several careers. They had been club fighters, Merseybeat hitmakers, British invasion faces, survivors of lineup changes, club circuit veterans, and late career rediscoveries. Pender, one of the original voices, left after a farewell performance in London and later performed as Mike Pender's Searchers. Even the name had become something people could carry in different directions. But John McNally stayed. That fact gives the story its spine. From the earliest days in Liverpool to the final bow, McNally remained the link back to the beginning. Around him, the band changed shape. Frank Allen, who joined in 1964, became another long-term anchor. Later, Spencer James came in as singer, and Richie Burns joined on drums. The old lineup was gone, but the sound kept traveling. Loss followed them too. Tony Jackson died on August 18, 2003. His later life had been hard, including illness, arthritis, and a reported prison sentence after an air pistol incident in the 1990s. Chris Curtis died in 2005. Other former members passed in later years. Little by little, the bright band from the old photographs became a story of survivors. That makes the final act feel heavier. For decades, the Searchers kept performing the songs that had once made them young. Sweets for My Sweet, Needles and Pins, Don't Throw Your Love Away, When You Walk in the Room. These were not just setlist titles anymore. They were time machines, carrying audiences back to a version of Britain, radio, and youth that no longer existed. Their influence also moved farther than casual fans might expect. The band's crisp guitar sound and harmonies connected with later artists, and members spoke proudly about links to the Byrds, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, and the Ramones. Tom Petty admired When You Walk in the Room. The Ramones covered Needles and Pins. That is a strange and wonderful legacy. A clean Liverpool pop group leaving fingerprints on power pop, punk, and American rock. Then came Glastonbury. The band had already said goodbye before, but the invitation was too big to refuse. So in 2025, John McNally, Frank Allen, Spencer James, and Richie Burns took the stage for the final farewell. Not at the start of the British invasion, at the end of a lifetime. And maybe that is the real story of the Searchers. They were not the biggest myth from Liverpool. They were not surrounded by the loudest legend, but they lasted. They carried bright songs through bad contracts, lost members, smaller rooms, old wounds, and changing fashions. The spotlight left. They kept playing until it found them again. So maybe the lesson is not that the Searchers were overlooked. Maybe the lesson is that they were underestimated. They came out of Liverpool with bright guitars, clean harmonies, and songs that sounded almost too innocent to carry damage. But behind Sweets for My Sweet, Needles and Pins, Don't Throw Your Love Away, and When You Walk in the Room, there was a harder story. Lost members, bad money, shrinking rooms, and decades of refusing to disappear. They did not become the biggest legend from Merseybeat. They became something stranger, a band that survived its own era. And in the end, when they reached Glastonbury in 2025, the goodbye felt less like defeat than proof. The spotlight had moved on many times. Somehow, the Searchers were still there.